So Emilia is one of those people where we'll have a conversation and my mind will just be completely blown. And what we're going to be diving into today, the first time I had this conversation with Emilia, my entire world was different after that. So I'm excited to bring that to all of you today.
The first and last thing that you'll hear on this episode is two things can be true at the same time.
Hey everybody, it's Bianca.
Welcome back, Evolvers. It's Emilia for episode 483, How to Hold Two Truths at the Same Time, an episode that Bianca wanted to do. So I'm a little nervy on this, Bianca, and I am hopeful that the listeners joining us today are coming from a place of curiosity. And before we even get into the questions and the dialogue for today, I would love for you to share with the listeners what they will get out of this per your questioning and whatnot, the conversation, and why they should care.
So a very large challenge that you and I have seen within the people that come to work with us, and honestly, I've dealt with this in my own life too, is we have a really hard time understanding the duality of things. And I'll have you dive into what a duality is and so on and so forth. But we have a hard time seeing like multiple aspects of a situation. We have a hard time seeing multiple different points, multiple different vantages, having multiple different ideas on a similar topic. And therefore that leaves us in this very all or white, black or nothing, black and white, all or nothing, binary type of thinking where we're only seeing one side of the coin, and that's leaving half of our life wildly empty. A lot of friendships are being broken up right now because they can't see each other's perspectives. A lot of relationships that are going through turmoil because both parties are having a hard time understanding that I can feel right in what I'm saying, and I can also believe that you're right in what you're saying. So this conversation, why I think people need it so desperately, number one, I struggled with it substantially. And what we've come to learn from our listeners is that a lot of the challenges that I have or have had in the past are what a lot of people are going through. So having the chance to ask you some of these questions, because you really were the person that helped me to get out of it, I think is going to be so beneficial for everybody who gets to listen today.
Cool. I'm super excited. And let's get going. So one thing, full disclosure, I didn't realize, and which is going to be really interesting for this conversation, is that this is not a typical way of thinking. So as a neurodivergent through and through, without really self-identifying with that, it wasn't until Bianca and I really started getting into like the metacognitive conversations that we have, which is how we think and observe our thinking patterns and what we think about our thinking. And she and I having conversations around that would help us explore the way in which I would be thinking about something. Let's say, for example, I don't know, understanding, I don't know, what's a good example for this, Bianca? Like the first time we had this conversation and it blew your mind.
When you taught me about the equal opposite way of looking at something.
Okay. So let's think about, let's think about relationships. Intimate relationships or interpersonal relationships is something so common. So if I was having a dialogue with you and something was going on in your life and you had this person and you were in a conversation, the way in which you would be thinking about it would be very, quote unquote, initially, right, when we first had the conversation, would be very narrow. Would be very focused on your perspective. And that is what we would refer to as the binary thinking, right? It's only your focus, the way in which you think, and there's only really one quote unquote train of thought. Now, all of us will hear the terminology train of thought at one point or another, hopefully in our lives. And what does that actually represent? It is the quite literal chain of thoughts that we're having that lead us to come to one conclusion or another. So in the context of an interpersonal relationship, let's say, for example, you have a friend that wants to, I don't know, go on a lunch date or whatever, the way in which you might be thinking of this selection of destination, let's say for a brunch spot, the chain of events have led you to conclude as a result of the chain of your thoughts to this is not the best place for a lunch date given what this person and me want to quote unquote do. We want to have a nice casual, intimate setting where we can have conversations about some stuff that we haven't talked about in years. I don't think this place being like a really rowdy breakfast brunch area is really the best thing, right? So you see it from one vantage point, yours and yours only. Now, when you and I got talking about the metacognitive components of a conversation, like something like this, where I taught you the equal opposite thinking, for a long time, I didn't realize that having multiple trains of thoughts was not normal. So I've always thought in what's called trialities. So when you think and have one train of thought, it's literally like the only voice or the only thought that you are thinking. The way in which my brain works is I'll have 1,000 thoughts at once. And so I can hear multiple trains of thoughts that are happening at the same time. And that's so like 3 trains of thoughts are trialities. You can have more than that. That's called the quadrality. A duality, which is what we're talking about in this conversation, is 2 trains of thoughts that can be diametric opposites, and 2 truths can co-occur at the same time. So for example, when you and I would be talking about this, let's say, for example, friendship date, I would ask you, well, Bianca, what's the equal opposite of that? Yes, it can be the fact that this might not be a great breakfast spot for you and your friend to hang out. And notice how I didn't say but, right? Because 2 truths can be true at the same time. 2 things can be true at the same time. And have you considered her perspective at the fact that there's actually an outdoor area that she's aware about that you're not? Meaning, every single given conversation that you have with someone, there can be other things that are outside of your perspective, outside of your train of thought, that allows more truth to be kind of pulled into conversation. So we can go into what is quote unquote the neuroscience of neural dualism, which is ultimately that quote unquote 2 tracks of mind that are expressing specific brain states. We can talk about how neurodivergence is a little bit more of a different type of consciousness applied in a more erratic way. We can talk about binary thinking. How do you want to take this conversation so that it does satiate what the listeners need the most?
How is this different than dialectics?
Okay. Please, for the listeners, would you define such?
Well, that's what I'm asking from you. So how is this? So how is a dichotomy similar and or different to a dialectic? Do you still want me to pull up the definition?
Yep, absolutely. Because anyone that's listening to this episode, they might not even know what those are. And so I don't want to have a conversation about a conversation with a conversation that people don't know about, which is what I'm classic for.
Literally half of Emilia and I's conversations is like this, but she'll give me the answers a lot of the time in this, which is why it's just fascinating. I'm just like, oh my God. I'm just learning. It's so fun. Okay. That wasn't the definition.
So while you look for that, I'm just going to share with the listeners some of the most common forms of duality is, for example, one of the most basic commons is you can't have light, quite literally like lightness, light, I'm talking about what illuminates the room without darkness. For some people, that might be the first time and be like, oh my God, that's so true, right? You can't have darkness without light. That's a very classic duality. So you have to hold that those two truths can be true at the same time and actually are true at the same time. So meaning they're direct opposites. So the light, quote unquote, is a direct opposite of the darkness and vice versa, right? Flip it around. Darkness is a direct opposite. It's equal opposite of lightness. And so a lot of that quote unquote good and evil conversation can come in. And if you just combined light and darkness into one, you're not necessarily holding the actual duality of both that are true. And so when we start to talk about like, okay, not necessarily more tangible things, we're actually talking about like actual things that are equivalent when it comes to interpersonal realms or whatnot. For example, another one would be, I can love Alan and I also can be extremely mad at him. I can be so upset and so happy at the same time, right? That's an emotional duality. So the way in which we think about our thinking, oftentimes we're just on autopilot. Number one, we're not thinking about our thinking. So metacog isn't even in the dialogue or in the introspection. And then even fewer people think about the types of train of thought that they have and the level of binary to which they are thinking. And additionally, to add another layer, how many different trains of thoughts are they able to focus in on, which then would allow us to actually start to explore the duality. So I know you have what you got on your end, I can tell. Talk to me.
I just didn't want to cut you off. I want you to keep going.
Appreciate it.
So a dialectic is a method of reasoning and discussion that uncovers truth by examining and resolving contradictions, moving from the thesis, idea, and antithesis or antithesis, counter idea, to a synthesis, new, higher understanding. So one of the challenges that a lot of our clients have, and I actually had a conversation with a client the other day where we were discussing this, he's having a really difficult time with the relationship with one of his parents.
Okay.
He is having a hard time holding the duality of, I love this parent, I've always wanted their love and approval, and I am so angry with them, and I'm actually starting to feel hatred for them for what they did to me. And the suffering that he's going through because he feels like it has to be one or the other.
Yeah.
DBT discusses dialectics, which is why I wanted to get your perspective on this and how they're the same, how they're different, and how maybe we can use dialectic-based skills like DBT skills to help people to see things in a much more nuanced way. Because you're masterful at this. I've never met someone who's more capable of seeing a multitude of perspectives than you. So how do we teach people to do that? How do we help people start being able to see that multiple perspectives, multiple realities, multiple feelings, multiple experiences can all be true, and you don't have to choose one or the other. You can make a decision based on the synthesis or the integration of them, which is what you're incredibly masterful at and why you are the CEO and nobody else is, because we can't do that yet as well.
Yeah, one of the things, so I just want to provide a little bit of context. So one of the things that first kind of brought me into this awareness of my thinking prior to you was actually in my undergrad. I remember when studying in philosophy, the difference between Plato's work and how Aristotle showcased the view of multiple souls, and then the contrasting philosophical debate between the René Descartes his view on ultimately the mind-body dualism kind of approach, and which one, quote unquote, is the entity of the spirit, right? Is it the body? Is it the mind? Is it the soul? What are those separabilities, or what is distinct? And so if anyone's familiar of that or not familiar with that work, I highly encourage you to start kind of exploring some of the ancient texts and the discourses around mind-body dualism, because of the fact that it helps you take this, quote unquote, observer, just through reading some of their works. It helps you take this observer role, if you will, in your thinking patterns that likely you're not taking. And so that quote unquote observer role of, whether it be your mind noticing and observing your physiological sensations, or what you quote unquote observe as so the mind or the body, right? What are your physiological observations, physiological sensations? Can you observe your mind? And that's a fascinating discussion in the neuroscience, in the kind of mix between spirit, body, soul, all that stuff. Anyways, why I mention that is because it brings you into the thinking about your thinking and what we call perception. And so for anyone that's struggling in a very practical, relatable example, like you just mentioned, Bianca, that client, how is it? And this is actually classic. When it comes to we mature as adults, we have this new adult awareness, and this is where duality comes into play. We have this adult awareness of what has happened to us as kids, and in this context is about the family and the family roles and family dynamics and how his father had treated him, all right? And and he has the experiential memory of what his father might have said to him, how his parents treated him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So you have experiential memory and adult perspective on that quote unquote experiential memory. And on top of that, how you feel about both. So he's actually experiencing what I would say a quadrality. And two things can be true, which is what he experienced when he was a little kid and how he felt about it then, and his adult perspective and how he sees the vantage point of how he was treated and he feels about that. So those two worlds are conflicting, colliding, and I could add even more dimensions on that, but I won't for the sake of our brains not blowing up. But at the end of the day, it can be really confusing in our internal experiences, especially interpersonally, because we might love someone so deeply and care about them so deeply, and we might have really difficult emotions like this client of yours, and both of those emotional experiences are colliding. And if you choose to have one emotion, let's say the love and the care for your parent who totally mistreated you and abused you and emotionally neglected you growing up and parentified you, let's just say, I don't actually know if this client, but let's just say that happened. And you just choose to care and love and just see them for all the quote unquote good, which is what a lot of people in this quote unquote maturation process and development process feels like they have to be in. This is why I'm going to use this as an example and go even deeper, because if I don't choose to quote unquote love and care this singularity of thought, then that means I have to hold the duality of thought and the emotional experiences around it. And I have to process as two things can be true at the same time. And when you hold a duality, not only is it more cognitively expensive if we just speak about it from a neuroscientific standpoint and how very little people have extra reserves to process both things as true. On top of that, it requires so much more emotional coping bandwidth to be able to navigate two realities. And human beings very much do not want to use what little quote unquote resources that they have to exist within two realities, because that's when things start to get really wonky, because then you start to realize that, oh my goodness, if two things can be true at the same time, what does that mean about everything else? And it can become this kind of bigger ripple effect of overwhelm physiologically, overwhelm emotionally, overwhelm is just like the emotion that I hear constantly happening. So what happens when that person, last thing, then all of a sudden sits in this quote unquote middle, where I can imagine his like younger self is to the left of him, right? Sitting around a round table. And his younger self is saying, I fucking hate them. I cannot stand them. I don't want to be anywhere near them. They're not safe people, blah, 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 right? Has all those experiences there. And then to the right of him, he has this adult perspective that hears the younger version of himself and says, listen, like, we're never going to be in that situation again. It is not okay what they did. We will never accept what they did. And we want to have a relationship with them from this new vantage point, making sure we're never going back in that quote unquote young version of ourselves. When you have that situation, you are directly looking at in the face of what is life, which is the duality in and of itself. The lightness without the dark is not lightness at all. The darkness without the light is not darkness at all. And I think that that is a direct articulation of the human experience. Again, the suffering, you cannot actually experience the true joy and the true meaning and the true depths of life if you're not experiencing some of the challenge and some of the suffering and some of the pain. And that's where, when we hold dualities, it is, yes, the pain, but it also is the resilience and the gravitational pull that makes us what we uniquely are. Because I mean, I could be wrong at this stage, but in terms of the ability to hold duality about one's own experience, the metacog on that, I mean, I think at this point, human beings are the only known species that have been proven to hold that. There's definitely like the octopus and other species that we definitely have so much to learn about, but my nerd will stop nerding. Bianca, what do the people need to know at this point?
How do you get yourself to the place where you can actually do that? Because our brain is wired to preserve our sense of self, to preserve our identity, to preserve our own senses of comfort and security and safety and so on and so forth. And it can feel incredibly threatening. It can feel incredibly daunting. It can feel as though I am losing myself if I allow alternate notions, alternate perspectives, alternate ideas in. So how do you still feel as though you have a strong, stable sense of self? You know who you are, while also giving yourself the chance and the permission to do that, because that feels incredibly scary.
Yeah. Well, I think you really hit the nail on the head. When you don't necessarily have a strong sense of self, it's going to overwhelm the nervous system quicker to try to hold dualities. Although I do have a little asterisk on that, because there are individuals that I've worked with who actually, because of a lack of a strong sense of self, they actually are able to hold multiple dualities, not for too long. And if you were to ask me about the mental performance of such an application of actually getting results on certain areas, I can't necessarily attest to that, but that's another conversation. I do think that at the end of the day, we need to talk about the system overwhelm, right? The emotional ability to cope with when overwhelm comes about, right? Because like reality, let's just like, our reality is enough to try to like work through as it is. You then hold two things can be true at the same time. That's another reality that essentially your nervous system is paying maintenance on. And so I think the first thing that I go, whether you have a well-established sense of self or a wonky sense of self, at the end of the day, I think emotion-focused coping in that quote unquote observing mind is the most important technique that you can use in efforts to try to hold two things true at the same time. Meaning you have to be okay with uncertainty. And a very practical way in which you can do that starts, and a lot of people aren't going to like this, but if you can't sit and meditate and notice two things true or two physiological sensations at the same time in your body, meaning tension in your neck or a pulsing in your left thumb, that's going to be really difficult to then try to hold a duality when it comes to the world that you're constantly living in. There's many people quoted this time now more than ever that if we were actually to hold all the dualities that actually exist in life, we would like literally break and roll over and die, because our brain just, it struggles to kind of handle the one reality that we live in. Not to mention if we go into quantum physics and we start talking about the wave particle duality, like we would error out. You know, but what has your experience been? Because I know that when you and I started getting into this conversation, when I really named and when you were really vulnerable and shared with me, Emilia, like I don't think in dualities. I don't think in trialities. This is the only way I've been taught to think. Like no one taught me to think differently than this. And you were pretty vulnerable with that. And when we went through the equal opposite, I said, okay, Bianca, but what's the equal opposite of that? Meaning if you have a coin, right? One side is heads, whatever that is. What is its equal opposite? It's tails, right? Same thing with light. What is its equal opposite? Dark. And we kind of did some of those mind tricks, like what was happening within you and what did you, quote unquote, have to do in order to keep up in those conversations with me, or even to just exist in those conversations?
It felt immensely stressful.
Yeah.
Because one of the primary challenges that I had for so long was thinking complexly in general, like not even holding dualities, holding one thought very rigidly and being able, not rigidly, but very succinctly and very intellectually. I'll say it that way. I had a very hard time thinking about things in general back in the day, and I had a really hard time, formulating deeper thoughts and opinions on things, and my sense of self was wildly underdeveloped. So when we would start getting into these conversations and you would try to have me to think from a couple of different vantage points on topics, my entire nervous system started to shut down. I started going into like a dorsal collapse state because my entire nervous system was like, this is too much. This is too overwhelming. I can't do this.
Yeah.
And so from a personal experience, I agree 100%. The ability to do emotion-based coping, emotion-focused coping is absolutely critical to be able to sit in the conversation, to regulate your nervous system, get your prefrontal cortex back on check, and then to be able to engage in a more thoughtful dialogue, seeing more than one vantage point.
Yeah. Yeah. And the vision, just, you ever see that vision or that image where it's like a ball of yarn and it's like multiple different strings? It's just this rainbow ball of yarn with like all the strings pulled out, and each string represents emotion, one emotion. That visual just comes to mind because quite literally the overwhelm of the nervous system that you're related to is what so many of us experience on the day-to-day, just in our quote unquote driver's seat of our one reality, our one train of thought that we have. And I would say the next step for someone who really wants to start exercising, right? Because this is like, if I had a ton of strings, it's like expanding the way in which your mind thinks. It's not just 1D, it's 6D, right? You're able to see it very differently and complexly. And that's what conceptual thinking is, very much so. You're holding multiple different points of a quote unquote possible reality, and you're able to look at the different points. And people who can expand their thinking from 1D to 2D to 3D, literally multiple dualities, you're able to conceptualize and ideate and have creative thought flow and generate multiple outcomes far more than someone who just thinks in a one-track mind. And it is the development of the higher cortical level of thinking that makes that possible. However, when you're in a dorsal collapse shutdown state, when your body is overwhelmed and is like hitting its upper threshold and you're collapsing and you're not even, in that conversation, you're not going to have access to that higher cortical thinking. And this could be a whole conversation about how do you develop that in someone that's young. But for more intents and purposes, the people who are joining this conversation with us are not necessarily in their 6-year-old developing brain. It is likely someone in their 30s or 40s that are really trying to learn how to expand their thinking or to evolve their thinking. And to be able to do that while holding that quote unquote ball of yarn, knowing that you are an emotional being, there's going to be emotions that come up as you try to process your every single day. When you can take that quote unquote visual of a ball of emotions, picture all different colors of string, each one of those string representing an emotion. When you can increase your emotional literacy skills, there are stats to show that you can decrease the overwhelm that you have. So I would say outside of developing that observer-based self and that physiological arousal observation, when you can increase your emotional literacy, i.e. naming and attuning to what emotion is coming up. So like, for example, you mentioned overwhelm. You've gotten so much better, and I've observed this, by knowing when your nervous system is starting to get overwhelmed and being able to name that overwhelm and knowing exactly what to go do to navigate that overwhelm such that you're able to stay in a conversation that can hold dualities. Now, I've seen you literally collapse in conversations. I've seen you go above and beyond to where it's literally like a wave. It's like a sine wave where you get super overwhelmed. There's a micro collapse, but then you're able to pick yourself back up and even go deeper into the conversation and try to hold that duality. And I would say that from at least observation, you'd have to let me know if this is true in your experiences, but you've taken that, essentially that ball of emotional experience that you're having, right? Oh, here's overwhelm. And you've slowly unwound it through that ball of yarn and slowly kind of pulled that out and recognized, like, in that moment, what is overwhelming? What is overwhelming to me is a part of me is trying to hold on to what I thought I knew, while also the grief emotion that's coming because what I thought I knew was true, when now I'm seeing data presented and that what I thought was true is not. And so that grief emotion is coming up, and there's another emotion, anger, that's coming up. So you were able to pull out the bits of yarn and actually process each one in order to continue to hang in conversations like those, re-engage in conversations like those, and now be able to start challenging your thought process to where it's not just 1D, it's 2D, and you're starting to begin to flex that conceptual thinking to where you're now holding two truths at the same time.
To start wrapping this up, and thank you for that, I really appreciate it. I completely attest that to the willingness that I have had to sit in the number of intense conversations that I have sat in and
Facts.
Develop distress tolerance skills.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't talk about this that frequently. I've mentioned it a couple of times on this podcast, but I invest more time, energy, and money into coaching and resources than almost anyone I've ever met. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm humble in the knowledge that there might be someone doing more than me, but to my current awareness, I don't know anyone who invests more in their personal development than I have. And so a massive reason for that is exactly this dialogue that we are talking about. My ability to be able to sit in discomfort, to sit in these really challenging conversations has substantially increased because I'm actively choosing 5 to 6 times a week to sit in front of someone who has a much higher awareness than I do and have them feed into me and challenge my thinking and help me recognize the emotions that I'm having and the cognitive distortions that I'm experiencing and the maladaptive limiting beliefs that I am having and the dysfunctional relationship dynamics that I'm experiencing and whatever other delulu that I'm going through. It's just been a
brutal
trip and a half that I wouldn't change for anything, because to be able to have gone from where I was before to where I am now to where I'm going, it's an exponential increase. So my takeaway for anyone listening to this right now. So number one, thank you, Emilia, for giving us some tidbits of your knowledge. This was incredibly helpful. And for anyone who wants to learn more about this, please reach out to Emilia. She's taking new clients. She is hands down the best clinician I've ever met, and I've met many. There is no one better than her. So please, if you guys are looking for someone to work with to help you with this, reach out to Emilia. My final takeaway, you have to be open to sitting in those uncomfortable conversations. They're gonna suck. They're gonna feel uncomfortable. That is literally the point. The more you can do that, that's a duality in and of itself. It sucks and it'll be worth it.
Right?
They seem
Literally.
opposite, but they're not. They're in tandem with each other. So final takeaway, final message, be very, very open as much as you possibly can to your current readiness score to sit in the discomfort of a conversation like that.
Yeah.
Do you have anything before I give my episode suggestion?
No, give yours and then I'll give mine.
Okay. 465, how good are you really at making better decisions?
Distress tolerance skills are by and large one of the most underrated skills when it comes to developing holding two truths at the same time. Bianca, your distress tolerance skills have come up and they continue to come up every single day. There will be times that will be stressful. There will be conversations that will be stressful. There will be, to the listener, moments where you go through two emotional experiences about your friends, your family, your career, your work. And one of the most important things that you can do as a rational creature, as a evolved human being, is learn how to navigate and hold an observer's mind during that distress and use your distress tolerance skills, like some of the things that we talked about, in order to navigate through a more objective reality where you can hold two truths as the same and navigate in a way that creates the best outcome. So with that being said, one of the biggest things that prevents us from doing that is our insecurities. We just get overwhelmed because of the insecurities that get presented. So my episode suggestion is number 444, why your deepest insecurities hold the key to your greatest growth. To that end, it is not going to be like squishy feel good all the time. And the more you can embrace that and understand that genuinely, the more growth you will have on this growth journey. So as always, thank you for your interest and your continued interest in the holistic science of mental health and mental well-being. We are so excited to have you as a listener, to have you join us this conversation. And if there was something that resonated with you in this episode and you stayed all the way to the end, you're an OG, pop a comments in the comment section in YouTube. We want to know what resonated with you. Bianca, anything in closing?
OG Evolver.
Fun conversation.
All right, everybody.
All right, everyone. Bye.
We'll see you next time. Bye.